Our second speaker is Jason Nuckols. Jason is project manager for the Nature Conservancy's coastal and freshwater program in Oregon. In this role, he is involved in creating and implementing effective strategies for conservation of in-stream floodplain, wetland, and estuary habitats. Jason fundraises for and oversees project implementation in these systems throughout Oregon. He leads estuary work involving restoration, protection, and working landscapes. This has included creating an inventory of tide gates in all of Oregon's estuaries, developing a decision support tool to optimize for fish passage replacement, and serving in a technical role on many projects along the coast. Jason is currently managing a project to improve our approaches and increase the implementation of nature-based aquifer recharge across Oregon. With that, I'll hand it off to Jason.
Thank you, Greer, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you, Guillermo, for that amazing introduction. You're kind of a hard act to follow, so sorry to be in the second spot here. I'm going to try to provide some context to this conversation from what's happened in Oregon over the last decade or so, everything involving tide gates and working lands, and share a few of those products that Greer just mentioned with all of you. Sorry, there's a delay here. Here's a fun visual to start with. Yes, the Columbia makes up 145 million of these acres, but I find it very telling to think about our estuaries as a gateway to so much habitat across the Pacific Northwest. All of our estuaries are unique, but almost all of them have something in common. The majority have been drained and converted for other uses like agricultural fields and pasture lands. And doing that, we've used infrastructure such as tide gates, channels, and levees. Fortunately, over the last couple of decades, many organizations have given a lot more focus to these tidally influenced areas, more research, more conservation, and more restorations happening. And with that ramp up in the estuary conservation, and as a result of much of this outreach, many organizations have awakened to these challenges and the opportunities presented with some of these tide gate infrastructure. From what little documentation is available, and from the stories of many of the multi-generational farmers on the Oregon coast, the first tide gates in Oregon were installed as early as the late 1800s, and the big ramp up in tide gate installations in Oregon was about in the middle of the 20th century. This puts the majority of our tide gates at well over 70 years old, and you all know how well infrastructure holds up on our coastal conditions. So most of our gates, like Guillermo said, are past their lifespan. They're failing at what they were designed to do. And of course, they were not designed to do what, they're never designed to do things like support fish passage and such. The earliest tide gate replacement projects using newer technologies and incorporating conservation goals, such as fish passage, into their designs began in about the early 2000s here in Oregon. So given all the challenges around tide gates, many organizations came together to organize the Tide Gate Partnership here in Oregon. This partnership was very well attended for some time. We focused our collective effort on finding solutions around funding, engineering, design, and permitting of these gates. A summary of the work of this partnerships and some of the accomplishments can be found on the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board's website if you'd like to go in and dig a little bit deeper. I'm going to share some of those things right now. One of the first tasks, as was mentioned earlier, was knowing where our tide gates were and what condition they were in. We had many incomplete and dated data sets to start with, but no one good inclusive data set. So that's what we had to do. The Nature Conservancy organized and private donors funded all the watershed councils up and down our coast to get boots on the ground and boats in the water to update this data. We identified over 700 of primary gates. I use the word primary just referring to the ones that are usually larger, the ones that meet the river and the estuary or the slough or the streams. And there are many, many, many more secondary gates. These are usually those smaller gates, the ones that are found interior to the primary gates. Not all of these were inventoried. For privacy purposes, these data are housed on the Oregon Explorer website, and where we only share location and ownership. But for more detailed data, you can access that through individual watershed associations or the Nature Conservancy. Approximately 90% all of these gates are privately owned, and many landowners and drainage districts don't have the funds to upgrade their gates, especially now that upgrade must meet fish passage standards, of course. So organizations doing this work like watershed councils, land trusts, soil and water conservation districts, amongst others, began to leverage conservation funding to pay for this infrastructure. They were using that conservation funding because we see that these infrastructure projects can provide ecological uplift. And some of the largest funding inputs that we've had in the state of Oregon I've been from the state. They set aside money through Business Oregon to fund these projects. NOAA has probably been our largest funder for many of these projects. And there's been additional substantial contributions from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that is another thing that we were tackling, permitting. The tide gate replacement regulatory review and permitting process is very challenging, very time consuming. For example, on the federal side, you will have United States Army Corps of Engineers, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Federal Emergency Management Authority. On the state side, you can have Department of State Lands, Department of Land and Conservation, Department of Environmental Quality, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, State Historic Preservation Office. And then believe it, on top of that, we can have county permits. And county permits can be very challenging. Each county has their own permits and they interpret state and federal laws differently. And lastly, there's tribal historic preservation and archaeology. So in the end, in this permitting process, you can have up to, if not more than a dozen permits. You can imagine how challenged that is. So to navigate that process, the partnership created several resources to make it a little bit more clear. These products, are meant to outline the roles and responsibilities of landowners, permitting agencies, and others, including and include those expected outcomes of what's supposed to happen. The process maps are available in two versions. There's a landowner process map that can be used by tidegate owners to fully understand the actions and decisions needed to permit the tidegate projects. And then there's a full regulatory process map that outlines all the major steps that the agency regulatory processes are happening. And there's also an agency review process map so that people can understand what's happening kind of behind the scenes. What are the agencies doing? What you don't know, you kind of look behind the curtain. One of the big wins in the permitting that I see that happened during this period, working with the state and federal and private partners, was NOAA created a new programmatic biological opinion. This was called the Tidal Area Restoration Programmatic Consultation. It was created to improve regulatory process efficiencies for the applicants. And again, all of these maps, these products that I'm referring to, are still found on Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board's website if you'd like to go take a look at them. So as we continue to learn more about the number and the state of our tide gates, more projects started ramping up. This is a before and after image of one project. The before replacement on your left-hand side there, this site had a 5-foot top hinged round wood and steel tide gate. It was blocking access to about 200 acres of land. The replacement gate on the right-hand side here is an 8-foot by 8-foot square muted tidal regulator. We'll talk about muted tidal regulators more. The full project here, which included very nice enhancement restoration actions, cost over $1 million. So even with that funding, we knew that we couldn't fully fix all of the tide gates. So we needed to focus on those tide gates that give us the highest return on investment, the highest impact for the projects that we're doing. That's when we set out with the goal of developing a tool to assist. Sorry, I forgot. Got into lag there. Yeah, we're good. We set out with a goal to develop a tool to assist our user groups when they're retrofitting and repairing and placing tide gates so that they can maximize fish and wildlife benefits for the least cost. We began this work almost a dozen years ago by looking at a lot of software and modeling packages. Eventually, we settled on a widely used fish passage optimization model developed by Jesse O'Hanley called OptiPass. There's many others using this optimization approach, so it's a known tool, proven tool. The California Fish Passage Forum uses this. Projects in the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Maine use this. And probably the largest fish passage project in the world that I've ever heard about is called Amber, where they optimized and used optimization for all of Europe's barriers using the same tool here. This model is excellent at looking at streams and linear networks, but we needed to consider the horizontal flow of water across the estuaries and the tidal floodplain. So TNC adapted this model to consider the tidal effects in the landscape, in addition to that stream network. The intent is to help point private and public investments to tide gate locations that provide those greatest gains. And then we wanted to add additional functionality. So we reached out to all the stakeholders up and down the Oregon, some of the Washington coast. Overall, these stakeholders expressed strong interest in how tide gates can protect infrastructure. This included protection of private infrastructure as well as agricultural lands, farm structures, houses, and public infrastructure like roads and municipal buildings. Other interests that emerged from this feedback was the role of tide gates in flood risk reduction, tide gates' effects on fish and wildlife, water, habitat quality, and such. Following this outreach process, our next step was to identify and evaluate those spatial data sets that were available. So this is the question our tool is asking every time. What's the set of tide gates or culverts in a watershed that, if removed or replaced, could maximize the net gains for a limited financial budget? And I'm going to show you a series of screenshots that show what one optimization scenario would look like. This is a home page that tells you what you're seeing. It links to a paper and a manual of the tool. The help page lets you know just how to run the tool, how to interpret your results. There's a start page where you input your parameters, like the geography that you're interested in, your budget, your targets that you want to look at, the climate scenario, which runs for current conditions or conditions as far out as 2100, assuming sea level rise. And then here, I've chosen two basins on the southern Oregon coast, the Coos and the Coquille Basin. This map zooms into the geography. I've also chosen a budget of $10 million, which happened to be a recent grant request. The tool defaults to budget increments, 10 here, but you can adjust that. I've chosen coho stream miles and coho inundation habitat as my targets, and I'm running it for the current sea level rise. So here the optimization has been run. The output tab shows your results. The first thing you'll notice is a return on investment curve. This return on investment curve is created for each target we choose. There's a budget across the bottom, there's stream miles across the side. The return on investment curve shows us that for $10 million, we gain access to a little over 70 stream miles in these two basins. But what we notice is that curve has not started to flatten out. So there are many, many more stream miles to access. And then there's a budget summary at the bottom that tells us how many gates we were able to replace for that budget and how much habitat that would open up. Now I'm showing the other return on investment curve for tidal inundation habitat. And notice at this point, the curve has started to level off. And that's telling me that for $10 million, these projects are approaching access to the majority of the inundation habitat in these two basins. So I might not want to invest any more money, more than $10 million in these two basins for that habitat or that benefit. And lastly, there's a budget barrier table that has the details of each of the tide gates chosen at each budget level, and these would highlight on the map if I were showing it in real time. A GIS data viewer helps us illustrate what this process looks like on the ground. Here I've zoomed into the lower Columbia River, but the bottom right is approaching the Portland area of Oregon. The upper left is at the mouth of the river in the town of Astoria. Now I'm going to zoom into this area south of Astoria. Oh, go back one. This is Youngs Bay to the west and the John Day River to the east. Advance. There we go. Sorry on mine. These white polygons you see are the tide gate watersheds. The tool uses these watersheds to calculate the area of drainage, the peak flows, and these inform the tide gate size and the costs in the model. You can see yellow dots where the primary tide gates are located. Orange crosses illustrate the secondary gates. And the red diamonds represent culverts, which are also included in the model. And if we were interested in fish habitat in the area, this is what we would look like. In addition to the stream miles for each salmonid in the area, we have the area of possible inundation depicted in light blue there. If we were interested in infrastructure or agricultural lands in the area, this is what it would look like. We have ag lands in green. If you squint, you can see some private buildings in red and some public buildings in purple there. Roads and railroads are represented in this footprint as well. And then we can run the statistics for the Columbia Basin, any tide gate, any set of tide gates that the model is spitting out. Um, Optimization tool. I shouldn't really call it a model. It's amazing to see, the area of influence behind these gates is over in the Columbia Basin is over 75,000 acres. There's many, many miles of affected salmon streams, thousands, tens of thousands of acres of agricultural lands. And then you'll see in that benefit summary, I apologize, this is small, but if you see that in most cases, our future scenario, we're only going to have more area impacted or more area affected by tide gates than we do in current conditions. And for the entire Oregon coast, it's quite impressive to see how much land, water, and infrastructure are impacted by these gates. A few statistics, over 1,100 miles of salmon-bearing streams are affected by the gates. Well over 1,000 buildings are affected by the gates. Well over 22,000 acres of estuary habitat are affected. Over 20,000 acres of farmland are affected by gates. But as we've gone along, we've done all of these projects and we continue to ramp up this work. Our understanding of the effectiveness of these projects, as Guillermo was talking about, is not kept pace with the number of tide gates being installed. There were no standards for monitoring protocols and no guidance for project managers, really. Of course, this is going to limit our ability to compare results. It inhibits transfer of knowledge. And it limits the capacity for monitoring results to really just inform adaptive management. And that's what it's all about is adaptive management, I believe. So we came up in the last couple of years with a standardization of monitoring protocols. The goals of this project were to establish consistent and comparable monitoring methods. This project promotes distribution of knowledge across geographies. It standardizes these practices. We were very smart in making this useful for all tide gates, regardless of scale, location, or funding. And we really want this to, inform those future results. And just to say, this body of work was developed specifically for tide gate practitioners of mine. It's meant to provide a simple and flexible framework for practitioners. Whether you're new to tide gates or whether you're very, very experienced, you should be able to use this. I'm going to walk through it quickly. We used a tiered approach, very, very similar to a lot of monitoring approaches. Tier 1 is for the simplest of projects. These are smaller, they have no identified habitat behind them, no formal monitoring plan, and they get implementation monitoring. The scale 2 is for all projects fall into this. This is implementation monitoring and compliance monitoring. And then the third scale, the larger, more complex projects, receives all three types of monitoring, implementation, compliance, and effectiveness. This is the implementation monitoring data sheet. It's very, very simple. Any project manager or contractor should be able to fill this out within a half hour. We recommend that you write this into the deliverables of a design contract. These data sheets are recorded and housed in a clearinghouse that's provided for all practitioners to access and use. That's found on Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Services Natural Resource Information Management Program. Yeah, that's what it is. And this is just like if I'm starting a project, where could I go to look to find one of these data sheets? Who was the project manager? What was their project like? And it would give me a good starting point. Maybe just a phone number of someone to call. The next level up is the compliance monitoring. This is ensuring that projects are functioning as designed and you're doing what your permits say you should do. When done correctly, compliance monitoring ensures that the early detection and rapid response should anything go wrong. This is all the climate. This ensures all regulatory and legal requirements are met for the state of Oregon. Sorry for the big spreadsheet. Close your eyes if you need to. This is the effectiveness monitoring. It goes beyond just making sure that a project is operating as designed and are meeting permit requirements. Each parameter here is grouped by restoration goals along the left-hand column. Each monitoring questions are available, or we put monitoring questions in there, make them available to stimulate your thinking so you can develop a monitoring plan. Each monitoring question is then paired with a measurement parameter, and each measurement parameter is then linked to a specific monitoring approach. That we provided a quantity, frequency, and duration guide that provides 2 funding scales, kept it very, very general to less funding or more funding. You know who you are. This allows project designers to take a plug and play approach to design this monitoring strategy based on their goals, their available funding, and their project requirements. And then there's an advanced monitoring section that includes and identifies additional parameters. And finally, there's a parameter for each one of these. There's a parameter. Each one of these, parameters is associated with a protocol worksheet found in the protocols chapter. This is an example of one of those protocols. There are 26 total. They're 1 to 2 pages. They're color coded, matching the monitoring table. And again, these are really designed for practitioners, trying to make this as user friendly as possible. And I think the last project that I wanted to mention here was a study that we did recently to kind of better understand the benefits and the costs associated with tide gate improvements for private landowners. We wanted to address the reservations that some people might have about investing in tide gate modernization, particularly if they're uncertain about the direct benefits to their land, to their crops, to their operations and their production. The agricultural industry in Oregon plays a crucial role on the coast, the local and the state economy. And this report used existing data sources and information from interviews to categorize and quantify the benefits of tide gates to private landowners. One big recommendation that came out of this project, but is ripe for tackling now, didn't happen in this project, is that in the future, a real serious cost benefit analysis using site-specific data would be great. This method, of course, would require pre and post project periods for one or a series of projects, so we could see on a specific farm with a specific producer or producers, what changed there in your water management, your grass production, your hooves on the ground, your weight on cattle, and things like that. So there's a lot of good information here, and there's even more. We hope this is a good tool for practitioners to take into the field and to share ideas with private landowners. And I think that's all I have for you. I really look forward to the panel discussion. I know I went through that quickly. That's a lot there. Our contact information, I'm sure, will be shared afterwards, and I encourage people to reach out with questions, even if they're not answered today. Extend special thanks to so many and appreciation for so many people and organizations, more than I have time to name here. With that, I think, thank you for the opportunity, and probably have time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Jason. I've heard about your efforts in Oregon a long time, and so excited that we're getting to share that more broadly in this workshop today, and definitely looking forward to the panel discussion later. So a few questions have come in through Slido, and I had a few that I wrote down and modified as we went. The first one that was promoted and put in here is really something I'm interested into and something I hear a lot about. It is pushback from different entities about tide gate work. So oftentimes you're replacing a barrier with a barrier. It may be less of a barrier, but it's still a barrier. So how do you respond to that? And also the whole idea that if you pay for an upgraded tide gate, then we're sort of promoting and perpetuating the problem on the landscape. So how have you responded to that when you hear that criticism of tide gate projects?
That's a presentation within itself, and we could spend the entire 90 minutes of our panel talking about that as well. I guess I'll start with something I stole from a colleague, I believe, said it first, is replacement, use a baseball analogy. Replacement and repair is like hitting a double in baseball. Removal is the home run. That's what ecologically would be most important and most uprise in all scenarios. But as you saw there, over 90% of our tide gates are privately held. Over 50% of our estuaries in the state of Oregon are in private ownership. And if we want to impact or affect or improve conditions on private working lands, this is what we have to deal with. And you had a second part to your question there. Oh, invest. Yeah. We've made so many decisions, as you see. There are so many gates that cannot just be removed as well. We have gates. We have towns, several towns in Oregon that are behind tide gates. We have railroads and roads. Highway 101 is impacted by gates in places. So I think, with the improvements, as we're going to see later, uh, we are doing better than we did before. The new technologies, the media title regulators, and others are showing improvements and showing impact, and the investment is paying off. But it's not that wouldn't be the goal if we hadn't have made 200 years worth of decisions to put people, nature, and business, behind tide gates.
Thanks. Great answer. Glad you've thought that through. The next question I think is also relevant to a lot of practitioners on the landscape dealing with tide gates. What advice do you have for an entity or an organization that's coming into this and sees a problem, but maybe doesn't have the resources to go out and do the extensive effort that you've done in Oregon? Is there advice you would have for how you would approach this problem of prioritizing and identifying tide gates across a large area? And what would that look like?
Mhm. Well, I do believe we've created some good tools in Oregon that were meant to share. Every decision we made in the tide gate optimization tool was meant statewide, but we also use data sets that we hope to move up and down the Pacific Northwest. There's no reason that the same approaches couldn't be used elsewhere. I would just say that people aren't starting at a place of knowing nothing about their gates, but things like knowing where they are essential. And 10 years ago, we didn't have that information. So I don't think that it's as dire as people might make it sound like. There's a lot of people from Oregon, I know, Washington, British Columbia, that would be, very happy to do some side consulting, so to speak. It's all about leveraging this work. We don't do it for one place. And the more that we can help out and impact others, it's just beneficial for everyone. So.
And then a follow-up question, I think, you've come a long way, you've produced the optimization, the prioritization results. So who do you see using that information? What type of organization or entity is using it? And at what scale are they using it, and how are they using that information?
Uh-huh. Um, I've seen it anywhere from our agency personnel's using it, people sorry, our funders can use it. You can, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board is often asking the question now, if you are requesting tide gate finances or are funding for a project that includes a tide gate, let's see where, your tide gate falls in an optimization model. Tell me what the uplift are, tell me what the targets are in your project. So you see a state agency that's using it there. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Service and several other departments have reached out, and we've used the optimization tool to look at the best areas to put limited financial dollars on the landscape. So we use it in granting scenarios. There's always an upper limit to a grant. Say it's a fish passage grant. Average award is $2 million. We'll take that $2 million, plug it in, look at a couple of different geographies, and depending on it might be focused at Coho, it might be focused on Chinook or something. We can use it for granting purposes, just to run different scenarios out as well. Where else? Watershed councils at the watershed level are using it for planning and granting, and just conversational purposes, because it really is supposed to be a conversation starter, so that you can go out on the landscape. I like to use it to take to a landowner and show them, hey, this is the effect of your gates, and this is the uplift. This is the change that we could see on your landscape in water management, and the way that you manage water across a tidal estuary, freshwater or saltwater, is how you manage production in a farm field as well. So it's all about water management. And the last one I want to say is we've worked with the Wild Salmon Center on the Coho strategic action plans to incorporate the optimization, tide gates, and fish passage in. So the Wild Salmon Center leads that work up and down the Pacific coast for coho recovery as well. So there's a few of the ideas for how it's being used, but it's I sometimes I don't like decision to be used in there. I like it to be conversation and the beginnings of a conversation, I guess, something that can get people started in thinking about the process.
Great. We have time for one more question, and this one has been promoted and was also on my list. Generally, Oregon's come a long way. You've worked through a process of developing guidance and getting partners around the table, and now you're at the implementation stage. What do you see as the key challenges to achieving agreement around the table on improving fish passage, and what are the strategies that you've come up with for overcoming these in your experience?
The key strategies in improving fish passage, will you repeat the last half of that again? So, yeah.
Yeah, so what are the key challenges you're facing now or you see
Yeah.
playing out on the landscape in these different projects? And do you see any sort of winning strategies on how to approach those challenges and overcome them? Just advice for those folks that are looking at implementation and maybe facing some of the same challenges.
Yeah, I think keeping this infrastructure discussion on the tips of our tongues with our legislation, with our funding agencies, and with those persons doing implementation on the ground, it really does start with the conversations, and we have to continue to keep the flow going, keep this momentum going, so to speak, because we've just really scratched the surface on what's out there, and the opportunities that are there. There's probably many, many, many private landowners that have never heard of this just because we work in, our little insulated bubbles of conservation and restoration and such. But I also, slightly different way to answer the question, I lean on what Guillermo said earlier. The more we can get out the results of some of the great monitoring work, that's going to enhance those conversations and probably lead to more funding and more good work. So as we're going to hear in a moment here from Zach and Dan about monitoring, promoting that, and just making sure that story is told. We also have challenges, and I think we'll get into it at the end, about management and adaptive management of the gates. And after installation, that's just the beginning of the work, So those gates have expected life expectancies of 50 years or more, and someone needs to be on the ground there, making sure they're doing what they're supposed to do.
Great. I'm glad you touched on that, and I'm sure we'll pick it up this afternoon in our panel and presentations because I think operation and adaptive management have come up a lot with these too. Thank you so much for your time. We're looking forward to having you on the panel in a little bit.